Japan Airlines has long been an emblem of Japanese culture.
JAL っていうのは私日本国そのものだと思いますですね。人、物、文化、情報をやっぱり日本と世界を結ぶこういった重要な役割を持っていると思います。
But less than a decade ago, Japan Airlines took a nosedive.
They've got $25 billion worth of debt, so their debt is 100 times what their valuation is.
It was so obvious that unless something dramatic changed, this whole company would go bankrupt, which would be a severe blow for the whole psychology of the country.
This is the story of how a nation's flagship airline nearly went bust.
Japan Airlines, it's likely to declare bankruptcy.
And how it was saved by a Buddhist monk turned CEO.
着実にあれを実行できれば私は再生可能だと思っています。
Japan Airlines was established in 1951, first flying domestic routes. In 1954, the airline launched its first international service, flying the Tokyo, Honolulu, San Francisco route, and began to build a special relationship with the Japanese people.
実家の方に帰る時の乗り換えがその JAL さんの方の航空機なので、そちらの方を利用してます。
With its emphasis on service, the airline has traditionally been a source of national pride.
JAL さんのいいところ、飛行機の中も綺麗ですし、すごいサービスもいいと思います。いろいろ毛布とかも気づいたらさっと出してくれたり、お水とかも頼んだら、すぐもらえたり。
JAL で。
ありがとうございます。
In 1970, Japan Airlines acquired its first Boeing 747 jumbo jet, the first Asian airliner to buy one. And by 1983, Japan Airlines became the world's #1 performer for both passenger and cargo transportation. It maintained the #1 position for the next 5 years.
The economy has been roaring. The demand for air transportation obviously has been rising a lot, and that helps spoil Japan Airlines' performance. For many of the routes from Japan to any other destinations internationally, it was the only carrier from Japan at that point in time. So its competition is limited.
In the mid-1980s, Japan Airlines management recommended that the airline should no longer be government-owned, but instead operate as a privately run company to improve professionalism and profitability. With ambitious expansion plans, Japan Airlines became fully privatized in 1987, with access to huge amounts of investment, using it to amass the largest fleet of Boeing 747s in the world. No expense was spared in its branding and marketing efforts. The airline built a reputation for offering premium services at economy prices.
Japan actually has a very strong culture of service that they try to, ahead of time, think about what customers may want or may request. And so, in the sense, customers are more relaxed because they know that these are some of the things that the airlines would have thought of and therefore are prepared to have a solution of sorts.
While its overseas competitors struggled to borrow enough money to expand their operations in the face of a global economic slowdown, Japan Airlines had a unique homegrown advantage.
In the early 1980s, the interest rate was 23.5%. Right? So this is where the U.S. topped out in the spring of 1982.
At exactly the same time, Japan Airlines was flying high, benefiting from extremely low interest rates of only 2.5%.
An airline like Japan Airlines with a 2.5% capital cost, competing against American Airlines, which may be paying at a minimum 23.5%. They have a tremendous advantage.
Japan Airlines could use those very low interest rates to borrow cheaply, keep costs down, and fares low to attract more customers. Philip Zerillo has used the company's story as a textbook example of what could go wrong in an airline.
Places like Mexico was running a 60% interest rate at the time. If we went to Brazil, somebody like Vera might have been facing at that time a 400% interest rate.
Brazil and Mexico were some of the most popular destinations for Japanese tourists. Japan Airlines flew direct routes to these countries, and low interest rates back home meant they could offer their customers great deals.
So to be able to keep up with the Japan Airlines and their investment in capital, places like Brazil, the United States, any place in Latin America was not going to be able to compete.
With access to a seemingly never-ending supply of cheap bank loans, Japan Airlines management continued their ambitious expansion plans, and now they looked beyond aviation for new investment opportunities.
But when you have access to a lot of capital and capital is very cheap, you tend to expand beyond your core businesses. And that's what they did at Japan Airlines.
The airline's board decided to invest heavily in foreign hotels, a very different business challenge from running an airline.
And they got farther and farther away from the core of the company, which was to operate an airline. You know, again, if we take something like hotels, again, capital is a very big part of building a hotel and operating a hotel, but it was well beyond their core competency of what they were skilled at operating and what have you.
In 1984, Japan Airlines acquired Marriott Essex House in Manhattan for an undisclosed sum before spending a further $100 million on extensive renovations.
ホテル事業に乗り出した。で、そのニューヨークなんかですごく有名なホテルを買収したりして、それがものすごい高いホテルなんですよ。で、当時は30年間満室でも黒字にならないと言われたような。The board's decision to invest heavily in new businesses with a growing portfolio of international hotels, resorts, and tour companies came just as the Japanese economy began to wobble. This aggressive expansion into businesses beyond their area of expertise left Japan Airlines badly overexposed and unable to cope with yet another run of economic downturns in the 90s. As passenger numbers dwindled, many of the company's planes sat idly, their value depreciating daily. The decision to diversify their businesses began to look like a very bad one.
The economy was sinking. They realized that the economy was actually busting. The boom that happened in the 1980s was probably not going to be seen again for a little bit. So the demand for air transportation and also some of the other services in the economy certainly were hit.
Assistant Professor Terence Fan has traced the attempts by the company's board to save the airline from the looming crisis.
If you look at the number of destinations it served, in places like Europe, for example, it used to serve like 12 destinations. It was cut to about 7. And then it used to have a lot of services in the Middle East area. And also, most of that was also cut as well in the 90s. So we see a lot of rationalization. But it's not clear whether those rationalization was enough to actually keep it going because the competitive landscape keeps changing.
To add to their self-inflicted problems, Japan Airlines were about to be rocked by a series of external events, which would threaten their very survival. By 1987, Japan Airlines was one of the most prestigious carriers in Asia, boasting the largest fleet of Boeing 747s in the world. Buoyed by the years of successful expansion, the Japan Airlines board began to invest heavily in other businesses linked to the aviation industry.
Now that seems like a logical and a simple expansion of what it is that they do. But they began to define that a little bit more broadly and say, look, we have the passenger, now we should get into hotels, now we should get into tours, now we should get into catering. And all of a sudden, you can see that this begins to expand beyond what they were probably skilled at or what they initially had as their DNA of the company.
Besides diversifying into other types of businesses, they also started buying up major stakes in smaller airlines that only flew domestic routes. And these acquisitions brought their own set of challenges.
One of the other things that they did is they tried to generate more revenue from the domestic routes. And they bought one of the domestic players. So they bought another airline, and as they brought that airline in, the airline was completely different. So the airline, as it came in, is flying different types of planes. So instead of flying all Boeing aircrafts, they might fly McDonnell Douglas or Airbus.
By buying another airline's fleet, the Japan Airlines board didn't realize they were buying a new set of problems, inevitably leading to further inefficiencies and escalating costs.
Now, if all of a sudden you have multiple plane makers, that means you have to have multiple spare parts. You have to have multiple crews because crews are not all able to fly just any plane. So all of a sudden, your pilots have to be instrument rated on a different aircraft. You have to keep crews that are different for McDonnell Douglas planes than Boeing planes, et cetera, et cetera. So this all throws off costs and rising cost structures in your labor model.
The company's board had developed some bad habits when they were state-owned. Now forced to compete in the open market, they had neither the experience nor the instincts to survive.
前はその政府が国の資本がほとんどの何が起こっても倒産することがない不沈空母と言われたわけですね。だけどその民営化になってからは本当にその今までみたいに政府の援助なしに自力でやっていかなきゃいけない。
Hiroshi Sugie, a former Japan Airlines pilot with almost 40 years' experience with the airline, remembers when things began to go wrong.
本当にその今までみたいに政府の援助なしに自力でやっていかなきゃいけない。そういう意味ではすごくそのいかにコストパフォーマンスを上げるかというね、コスト意識とかそういうことをその社員は考えなきゃいけなかったんですけど、結果的にはですね、そういうことを言ってた経営陣もそういう意識のチェンジができなかったということですね。
Instead of changing course by cutting costs and focusing on their core business, Japan Airlines tried to borrow their way out of trouble. It didn't work. In 1992, Japan Airlines posted $100 million in financial losses. It was the first time the company was in the red since privatization.
The big news story today here in the Asia Pac is Japan Airlines. It's likely to declare bankruptcy as early as next week, and there's a lot of trouble for the national...
In response, the company finally slashed its workforce and began selling off some of its assets, desperately trying to undo the lavish overspending of the 1980s. With the company already on its knees, a series of global disasters soon made life for Japan Airlines even more difficult. The outbreak of the respiratory disease SARS that raged across Asia decimated the numbers willing to fly. Hiroyuki Kobayashi spent 42 years as a pilot with Japan Airlines. He recalls the internal crisis brought about by the SARS outbreak.
SARS やっぱり パセンジャーお客様の数が減ったっていうことがありますですね。それが一番会社のマネジメント経営にとっては一番大きな影響がありましたですね。それからいろんなそのコストですね、いわゆるその交通費交際費あるいはいろんなミーティングを減らすとか、そういったあるいは宣伝を減らす。
And the blows kept coming. The New York World Trade Center attack in 2001 and the subsequent war in Iraq 2 years later rocked the global aviation industry. And the Japan Airlines board, previously insulated from real-world pressures by its government paymasters, simply lacked the practical experience required to deal with sudden turbulence. With global uncertainties looming, more people were choosing not to fly, and the aviation industry had to continue operating on steadily shrinking profit margins.
So if we think about what people pay in terms of the dollar figure, and in terms of on average, what airlines could get in terms of profit, what we expect is out of $100 that we pay, typically airlines only get maybe $2 or $1 or $5, certainly less than 10 in many cases, that they can translate into profits.
For Japan Airlines, their already tiny profit margins were wiped out when passenger numbers began to collapse. The company had to ask the government-owned Development Bank of Japan for an emergency loan of approximately $800 million, a desperate move that shook the confidence of customers and its own workforce.
もちろんみんな嬉しくはないですけど、不安は持ってたんですけど、これはもう経営破綻しましたので、これは仕方がないことだったと思いますね。
Mired in debt, shaken by a series of global shocks, and with an indecisive board, Japan Airlines' ability to survive looked far from certain.
The attack on Iraq has begun.
By the mid-2000s, a string of global events had put Japan Airlines into appalling levels of debt, amounting to over $2.5 billion. Even at home, Japan Airlines now lost its dominance of the domestic market to rival All Nippon Airways. The only response from the board was to take on further loans of nearly $630 million. So why were other rival airlines better able to survive these tumultuous times?
If we compare Japan Airlines with Singapore Airlines, we actually see Singapore Airlines being more profitable for more years and so on. And I think that has to do with the fact that Singapore Airlines for many years had been operating in a fairly competitive environment. And I think that helps keep management on the toes and in tune with the latest changes.
Like Singapore Airlines, Japan Airlines had always tried to live up to its image as the flagship of the nation.
So the unique thing about JAL is that it's a Japanese company, so it's got that sort of Japanese culture. They call it omotenashi here, so it's kind of expecting what the customer wants before the customer actually asks for it. So that's what makes them unique.
Keiichi Nukina is an aviation enthusiast who followed Japan Airlines over the years and learned to value the traditional standards of service offered.
One thing that distinguishes JAL from most of the other airlines out there is on several of their aircraft, they use a business class product called the Apex suite. So it's really spacey and it's kind of private. So it's considered to be one of the best seats out there. That's what makes their business class, at least on some routes, somewhat unique.
A uniquely Japanese approach to service that we embody.
But it was just this kind of old-fashioned, over-the-top service that was making Japan Airlines unable to compete with its more nimble rivals.
The biggest issue was the inefficiency, which was kind of caused by the mindset of we're invincible. So they were always backed by the government, so they always thought the government would have their back, and they would spend money left and right.
The crisis sort of opened all of the problems. Everyone suddenly could see as revenues broke away, as high-yield travelers, business travelers, didn't travel so much anymore. And then suddenly you could see how big the losses really were, how inefficient the airline really was.
Professor Jochen Wirtz has analysed why some service companies get things so badly wrong.
There was a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of complacency, very slow decision-making, and not really the guts and the energy to make deep-seated changes to the airline.
With the odds stacked against it, Japan Airlines came to a screeching halt in 2010. The company was collapsing under a terrifying $25 billion worth of debt. Japan Airlines had to file for bankruptcy protection. The company vowed to slash some 15,000 jobs and received yet another bailout from the state to the tune of $11 billion. But pouring good money after bad by itself was never going to do the trick.
Now, a sharp drop in traveler volume, if Japan Airlines can't commensurately reduce their operating costs, they're going to face a tremendous negative consequence on their earnings and their financial situation. And that's exactly what happened.
Tough aviation rules prevented Japan Airlines from coming up with flexible solutions to reduce costs.
Now, there were some things in the background that they couldn't really get out of. So one is in Japan, you weren't allowed to have your crews be multiple aircraft rated. So everybody was only rated for one type of plane. So the ability to convert to smaller planes or shift crews between planes, all of that stuff was off the table for them. Secondly, they had bought all 747s. I mean, they went to big planes and they didn't really fit the planes to meet the routes. What the smaller airlines were doing, or the startup airlines were doing at the time, is starting out small. And what they were doing is eating into the seat volume on each and every one of these routes.
By flying smaller planes, these airlines had lower overheads, operating with smaller crews and less fuel. The smaller airlines were able to fly at full capacity, while Japan Airlines was flying with far too many empty seats.
You know, when that happens, you'll be chalking up a lot of losses. Certainly, Japan Airlines was not alone in that, but the point was that starting before going into this crisis, it was already heavily in debt. It was not in a position to really make drastic moves, so it just could not really survive.
Faced with this existential threat, the former owners of Japan Airlines, the Japanese government, finally decided to intervene.
After the financial crisis, when suddenly the losses became so big that it was so obvious that unless something dramatic changed, this whole company would go bankrupt, which would be a severe blow for the whole psychology of the country. It was the flag, or it is the flag carrier. It's Japan Airlines. I mean, how can you let a company of a proud country go bankrupt just like that?
With national pride at stake, the Japanese government set up a committee of external experts to save Japan Airlines. Attorney at law Hideo Seto was put in charge of leading the turnaround.
それはね、航空業界に関係ないから。航空業ってね、やっぱり国の行政。権益と非常に密接な関係がある。この会社がやってきたことを、若干の変化を持たせるとしても、それを踏襲しながら、調整をするというぐらいのことしか、おそらく発想として出てこないと思う。だから全くの異業種の方からリーダーが欲しかった。
By 2010, the global financial meltdown had pushed Japan Airlines even closer to the brink of bankruptcy. The government decided there was one person who might just save the day.
まさにその組織の中で育っていった人たちの塊ですから、そこに全く異質の創業した人、それも異業界、別の業界からそういう人にお願いをして、新しい価値観、 それを現場と共有できるパワーも持ってる人、そういう人っているのかと考えた時に最初に思いついたのが稲森さんのこと。
私ももう1995年ぐらいから稲森さんの講演ずっと聞いてまして、この人が JAL の社長になったらいいなと思ったんですから、これはいいと思いましたですね。稲森さんが来ていただいて。
So Mr. Inamori was chosen to lead the new Japan Airlines. I think he's a great person to do so. Inamori came from was a company called Kyocera, who's into ceramics and electronics. What really makes this company stand out is that in the past so many decades, it had always been able to make a profit every year. So that's put Japan Airlines in stark contrast. So I think it's a great person to bring in to Japan Airlines to really rethink what it really ought to do.
Kazuo Inamori quickly put in place his plans to reverse Japan Airlines' ailing fortunes.
So the first thing he had to do is go to the Land and Ministry of Transportation and get loans and get bailout loans for cash and operating. He had to also go to the financial community and ask for some forgiveness of debt with the idea and with the promise that they would go forward.
But borrowing more cash was never going to be enough to turn things around. The new CEO next focused on the iconic status of the nation's airline and the damage that would be done to Japan's international reputation if Japan Airlines was allowed to go to the wall.
He began to talk about how if JAL was allowed to fail, this would impact the citizenry of Japan. They would face limited options in their travel. They would eventually face higher prices. This was a matter of national pride. This was a matter of national security of airplane travel. This sort of message to the regulators, to the financial community, eased their trepidation. They could buy into this message.
Inamori's quick actions may have stabilized Japan Airlines, but for the company to grow again, he would have to radically change the culture. The future of Japan Airlines rested in the hands of one man, Dr. Kazuo Inamori, a trained Buddhist monk with no previous experience in the aviation industry. Inamori was not a conventional choice as CEO, but amongst the Japanese business community, he developed a unique reputation for challenging common business practices and valuing people over profits, a philosophy he demonstrated by taking no salary for the first 3 years at Japan Airlines.
And he came in with a new vision and with hope and with common sense. And his first sort of focus was on let's build up the team and the team spirit and the culture again. Let's make our team be proud to be Japan Airlines again.
Inamori first had to convince the government that Japan Airlines simply could not be allowed to fail. A bankrupt national airline would be a stain on the nation's self-respect and international reputation. He persuaded the government to write off some of the debts. Next, Inamori turned his attention to some fundamental problems at the heart of Japan Airlines.
まずは全社員の物心両面の幸福を追求するんだ。これはやはりさすが稲森さんの経営理念っていうのはすごいもんだなと感服した。その人たちが一生懸命やればそれが結果社会に貢献できるんだ。自分で創業している経営哲学をしっかりした経営哲学を持っている。でその人のが自分の言葉で現場を動かす力を持っている。それから強い信念を持っている、極めて数字に細かい方。日本国みたいにどんぶり勘定だってたところが一気に変わったのはまさにそこのところが大きかったんですけどね。まあ能力それから 闘争心っていうんですかね。
社員の幹部社員の方々に対しては大変失礼なことを申し上げたと思いますが、しかしことほどさようにこれだけの何万人と6万人も7万人もおる社員をその生活を守っていかなきゃならないという経営者はですね、そういう採算というのがわからんようではどうにもなりませんと、そういう意味で大変失礼だったかもしれませんが申し訳ない。企業群が排出していければ資源問題も自然に解決するんではないかというふうに私は。
During his time running Kyocera, Inamori had developed a management style which flew in the face of Japanese tradition. Instead of every decision being taken at the top and handed down, now the workforce was divided into small units, each with a leader given an unusual degree of freedom. And every worker was made to feel that they had something to contribute to the company's success. Inamori called it the amoeba philosophy.
So the amoeba philosophy, as I understand from Mr. Inamori from his days in Kyocera, is that it tasks each employee groups or each individual employee with thinking about how his or her actions actually relate to the company's bottom line.
When compared with more traditional Japanese companies, this level of trust in the rank and file was genuinely revolutionary.
For years, people had taken for granted lifelong employment and a little bit of the fact that they are just serving their bosses. And there's a lot of inertia. At the very end of the day, if the company is not making profit, the employees can't be too happy. I think that's sort of one of the bottom line that he was able to instill into his employees.
Every yen or cent counts. It's not just penny pinching, it's a way of thinking. Employees, from pilots to maintenance workers to customer service reps, are encouraged to attend a philosophy course. Small steps leading to one of the biggest corporate turnarounds in Japanese history.
But Inamori could also make tough decisions. Faced with a bloated workforce, the former Buddhist monk was quick to wield the axe.
At the time, they were running about 50,000 employees. And 16,000 employees were going to be cut. So you're talking about cutting something north of 30% of your labor force. Again, 30% of the labor force, and that labor force that remained was going to be asked to take a 30% pay cut, and they were going to have their pensions reconfigured or revalued. Wow, these are tough things to get people to do. But again, he took that message of pride, integrity, national service. This is something that is an imperative for Japan, and he took that message to that group as well.
With a leaner workforce, Inamori was able to better focus on the day-to-day operations.
でそれが行政報告会というところで稲森さんが全ての数字を見ながら各部門の数字を見ながら細かくチェックをして数字のちょっとした動き毎月の数字のちょっとした動きについてこれは何だでそれ説明できないとその部門の担当者としてふさわしくないんじゃないのかというふうに一つ一つの数字についてきめ細かく見るようになって今どうなってるんだこれ毎月どういうふうに動いてるのかってそこに目を向けさせて。
There was to be no more passing the buck or hiding poor performance within a rigid hierarchy.
で JAL として世界の航空会社 LCC と差別化しながら日本航空が再建再生していくために何が必要なのか。
There were also valuable lessons to be learned from the smaller low-cost carriers or LCCs.
それは今の言葉で言えばおもてなし。そこを削減したら意味がないでしょ。削減すべきところはそういうところじゃなくてもっと別のところにたくさんあるわけ。それは、余剰人員を適正な規模にするとかそれから、本社の機能にしてもフロア数を減らしてお客様にかかるものに関してはこれをレベルを下げちゃいけない。
But even while cutting costs, Inamori refused to compromise on two long-standing principles of Japan Airlines: customer service and safety.
So during the bankruptcy reorganization, I think the airlines cut a lot in terms of debt, but I think the two things that they didn't cut, or we didn't see a lot of evidence, is in terms of investment in safety of the operations and also in terms of customer service. I think for the first ones, we haven't heard of major incidents since that time.
いわゆる交際費とか交通費とかですね、一般的なコストカット、これはもうかなり厳しくしましたけど、安全面ではですね、特に燃料を減らせとかですね。
In 2012, just 2 years after narrowly escaping complete financial collapse, Japan Airlines was once again recognized as the world's most profitable airline for that fiscal year.
そうなんだよ。それがすごいね。それはすごい。で、その時の利益がね、営業利益でね、600億を見込んでたんですよ。600億。で、それ絶対無理だと。こんなね、絵空事書きやがってと言われてたんだけれども、1年間頑張って、先ほど申し上げたような、コスト構造を全部こう見直しながらやっていったら、
With the company's finances settled and its workforce reorganized, Japan Airlines has been able to invest in new aircraft and offer its customers more routes.
It actually had made some investment decisions earlier in terms of acquiring new, modern, and more fuel-efficient jets called the 787 series. That in itself helped it become more efficient in some of the existing operations, as well as to open new markets. For example, it started new service to places like Boston and San Diego from Tokyo, so further strengthening its presence in the important North American market. At the same time, it was able to use some of these new modern fuel-efficient jets to open and strengthen some of its old routes, such as Moscow and Helsinki and in Europe, for example.
Customer service remains the airline's top priority.
So it's good in offering very professional business, business-friendly sort of service to customers who really are able to pay for the kind of premium services that it offers. It has certainly strengthened its connections and presence in North America and also to some key cities in Asia, in East Asia.
The final proof that Inamori had turned things around came when Japan Airlines launched its initial public offering in 2012 at $8.5 billion, the second largest IPO worldwide after Facebook.
いや、それは今は安定していると思いますよ、経営は。ただ、危機はいつ来るか分かりませんし、JAL の経営にいる人たち、経営を担っている人たちが2009年の1月の19日前後のことを忘れないで緊張感を持って取り組んでいれば、新しい課題が出てきても乗り切れるだろうなとは思ってます。
Inamori stepped down as chairman of Japan Airlines in 2013, and in 2015 he became an advisor to the new management.
You know, Japan Airlines probably today has the challenge will be to remember their failures, right? And to think about their future. They've trimmed down a lot of the non-profitable businesses. The cash flows are better, but you don't want to go back to the things that you once did. So learn from your mistakes. Don't repeat your mistakes. And I think that will be the challenge for the company.
And it won't be clear skies anytime soon, as a legacy airline company like Japan Airlines faces a different set of challenges with LCCs, or low-cost carriers. By offering a no-frills, cheaper alternative, these LCCs cater to a whole new segment of travelers with modest budgets.
日本の市場でやってればいいもんじゃなくて、もう海外からその伝統的な航空会社だけではなくて LCC がどんどんと入ってくるでしょね。でそれを利用する人たちの数がどんどん増えてるじゃないですか。 インバウンドが日本に来てくれる海外旅行客が増えた。そのかなりのものはやっぱりその LCC を利用している方たちでしょ。日本には席あるけども世界の人たちが日本航空を使ってくれる。だからインバウンドの人たちも日本人が外で出かける時も利用できると。こうしなきゃいけない。だから日本人が外行く時使うけれども帰りはその人たちがさらになってくると空席で送ってくれるじゃダメで、むしろ海外の人たちがそこに乗って日本に訪れてくれるよ。まあこれは航空会社だけではなくて日本の観光政策全体に関わるような問題なんでしょうけどね。まあ、そういう中で、これからの大変な時期にどうなんだろうね。LCC 基本的にはね短い距離をね多頻度でねポンポン飛ぶから。
They are definitely going to continue serving the premium routes with JAL, but they're also trying to start out a new low-cost airline for their medium and long-haul flights. They will be started in 2020, around the Olympics or before the Olympics.
The 2020 Summer Olympics in Tokyo will give Japan Airlines an added opportunity to boost revenues as a global audience flies in to support their athletes.
次の未来へ JAL は東京2020オリンピック・パラリンピックのオフィシャルエアラインパートナーです。
But the airline will need to ensure that the hard-learned lessons of the past are not forgotten.
I don't think it will try to grow as big as possible, but I certainly think it can grow consistently and profitably going forward using exactly the same philosophies that has guided Japan Airlines in the past few years.
Japan has a very strong image in terms of hospitality, in terms of their precision and their a strong adherence to traditions and to protocol and to reliability and to quality. And I think all of that is brought back into the Japan Airlines brand. And that is unique to them.
In 2018, Japan Airlines reported an expected operating profit of $1.5 billion. New routes are being offered to the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. But the challenge remains to maintain the traditions that made Japan Airlines its nation's flagship carrier without ever again losing sight of the bottom line.